Hello.
Francis, I don't know why my picture's not on.
Let's see.
Okay, that did it. That did it. I got it.
All right, we'll give everyone one more minute to jump on.
Oops. Okay. Yeah. I know. I won't say anything, I'm sure. Yeah.
Okay, Terry? Terry, I can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now? Am I on?
I can hear you now.
Great, thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
All right, Terry, thank you everyone for joining us today. I would first like to introduce Florida Democratic Party Chairwoman Terry Rizzo. Unfortunately, Representative Cindy Polo had internet issues this morning, so she can't make it. But Chair Rizzo, you're on.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. And thank you all for joining this call this morning. I want to thank especially Congresswoman Donna Shalala, who is with us today, State Senator Lori Berman, and Dr. Brett Schillinger for joining us on this call. You know, as we all know, as a state and a country, we are facing an absolutely immeasurable tragedy as COVID-19 claims more lives week after week after week. And health experts are warning that the crisis will continue to get worse before the pandemic hits its expected peak in Florida. But President Donald Trump and Governor Ron DeSantis are already turning their attention to relaxing the social distancing measures that continue to be critical to limiting the spread of COVID-19 here. However, Trump has not taken the steps necessary to open the economy safely and still does not have a strategy to implement mass COVID-19 testing. Public health experts have been crystal clear. We need national mass testing before we can relax social distancing. Trump's own CDC and FEMA have produced documents that warn of a risk of, quote, a resurgence of the virus if there's not enough testing. Trump continues his streak of breaking promises to America. His administration promised 27 million test kits by the end of March, but now they're saying they've only completed 3.5 million. The Harvard Global Health Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Did you hear everything I said, or should I start over?
Okay. We lost you at Harvard Global Health.
Okay, all right, thank you. Something happened, and I apologize on that. So with the Harvard Global Health Director, what I was saying is that the director has estimated that the United States needs to be conducting 500,000 tests a day to safely reopen the country, but we plateaued at 145,000 tests. That's just a fraction of where we need to be. And Trump has no plan to get us to 500,000 tests a day and has refused to take responsibility for his failures. Instead, he's blaming everybody but himself for this crisis. He spent his time on the bully pulpit lashing out at governors, at journalists, and the World Health Organization. He wants us to believe it's not his responsibility to manage this crisis. But we've seen how other countries that took this virus seriously with a comprehensive national strategy at the onset have successfully limited the spread of COVID-19. For example, South Korea. The United States and South Korea both discovered the first case of COVID-19 on the same day. That was January the 20th. But only South Korea's president took immediate action. The South Koreans rapidly scaled up testing, allowing them to identify and slow the spread of the disease before it spiraled out of control. Trump ignored his own intelligence briefings, called the outbreak and you can see my fingers, a hoax, and continued on with business as usual. And early actions matter. We saw it in South Korea, now has 20 cases per 1,000 people daily, whereas the United States has 142,000 cases per 1,000 people. And while other governors have stepped up to provide leadership for their states to compensate for Donald Trump's chaotic and erratic response, Governor Ron DeSantis has been with Donald Trump every single step of the way. And we've seen the impact here in Florida, where we do not have the transparency that health experts are pleading for. Private labs process 90% of our COVID-19 tests, and yet Florida is failing to release the number of tests that are still pending in private facilities. Again, we cannot manage this crisis without efficient mass testing. While I think it's important to start thinking about how to safely reopen our state and our country, we can only do it by solving the health crisis first. Trump and DeSantis are putting the stock market first, not the health and safety of our people. We need a president and a governor who put the health and safety of Americans and Floridians first. We do. We need a governor and a president who put the health and safety of Americans and Floridians first. Thank you, everybody. And now I'd like to turn it over to our Congresswoman Donna Shalala. Thank you, Congresswoman, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Terry. We're in a very dangerous period. As Terry pointed out, testing, testing, testing. That's what the Speaker has said. That's what the Congress, in a bipartisan manner, actually has funded. That's what our next bill will make a huge investment in. Look, right now we're only doing therapeutic testing. We're testing people to see whether they have the disease, and if they're sick, we're putting them into our hospitals. If they're not sick and they're positive, we're telling them to go home for 14 and lock themselves up basically for 14 days. That's just the first step. The next step is testing for control. And until we test at least 1% of the population in the United States, until we actually get our arms around this virus, we're in a dangerous period. This is precisely what happened in 1918. In 1918, they thought they had the virus whipped because they did a certain amount of testing, and then people went out on the streets and on the beaches, and the disease spiked again, much worse than the first time. And so we have to pay attention to the public health experts. They're telling us that, number one, we have to have a testing regime, a very strong testing regime. Number two, we have to have some therapeutics. We cannot get our economy back going again unless we have the testing regime in place and unless we have some therapeutics so that we can save some people's lives. And unless our hospitals can handle the cases within their regular beds. And that is, we've reduced the number of cases to the point in which hospitals can accommodate COVID-19 patients in their regular beds so that they can open up and start doing the other kinds of healthcare procedures that they need to do. I've actually introduced a bill. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Debbie Merskell-Powell are on the bill called the Reopen America Act that lays out these procedures that we need to have, that says the federal government is responsible for setting up a board like we had during World War II, purchasing all of the equipment that we need, including testing advices, and then distributing them fairly. Right now, Florida is competing with every other state. All of our hospitals are competing against each other. This is no way to stop a virus, to squeeze this virus down, to starve it. We need leadership from the government, and in particular from Governor DeSantis and from President Trump. But Governor DeSantis cannot be weak. He has to be a leader, and that means he has to lay out very strong procedures, and you cannot open up the beaches. As much as I'd love to run down to the beach, opening up the beaches is the most dangerous thing that you can do. We must demand leadership from our leaders in Tallahassee and in Washington, because this is about life and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Shalala. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Brent Schillinger. You're on.
Morning. Good morning. Thank you. The COVID-19 pandemic has certainly brought with it a considerable amount of uncertainty. And uncertainty is a really difficult thing for medical doctors. You know, we are scientists. We like to see specific evidence-based data that allows us to make reasonable attempts at answering our patients' questions. One question that I'm asked by patients, by colleagues, and I've been asking a lot of it to myself lately, is just how long will this pandemic last? You know, when is it that we're going to go back to normal or something like normal? And the answer is so uncertain. You know, just like the hurricane tracking maps, there are COVID models with projected timelines. And the model that most everyone follows is the one that comes from the University of Washington Institute for Health Metrics. And like the hurricane maps, this model keeps changing. In March, we were told that Florida would reach its surge, a peak in new COVID cases by the middle of May. Then a week later was a forecast that April 23rd would be the peak. Then the next week, which was last Monday, we heard the surge would arrive May 6th. And then a report that just came out 3 days ago on Friday, they said, oh, we've already passed our peak here in Florida. It was April 2nd. So this uncertainty, I'd like to emphasize, makes it so challenging for doctors and public health officials to develop strategies. Now, if we look at the data on the Florida chart, the curve does seem to be flattening. The number of new cases seems to be stabilizing. No uncertainty about that data. It's good news, but it doesn't by any means say that we're at the end of this pandemic. We're still seeing somewhere between about 700 and 1,000 new cases a day in Florida. Now, I think that Floridians are to be commended for largely respecting the social distancing guidelines, avoiding large gatherings, staying at home as much as possible, wearing masks. We can say with certainty that these measures have helped to reduce the number of new cases for sure. And to add to this, there was an endorsement last week when Florida Surgeon General Scott Rifke stated that social distancing measures would need to be continued until the creation of a vaccine, something that Dr. Rifke said probably wouldn't emerge for at least a year. Realistically, we can't stay at home forever. There are economic, there are mental health costs. But as you've heard from the earlier speakers, if we lift the restrictions too soon, we're likely to see a huge influx of cases here in Florida. And that's certainly been the case in Hong Kong. Now, just in the last few days, we've seen that in Singapore. It takes us back to a whole additional state of uncertainty. So is there room for some sort of compromise? Again, to cite the public health experts at Harvard Global Health, Dr. Ashish Jha says the answer is large-scale expansion of testing. Now, to date, as you've heard, Florida has tested only about 1.5% of our population. So there's a lot of room for more testing. Why is this important? We know that the virus spreads largely from infected people who don't show symptoms, what we refer to as asymptomatic carriers. Only wide-scale testing can we clear up any uncertainty about the identity of these probably contagious individuals. Without testing, you don't know if you're infected. You don't know who else is either. Furthermore, if we were to loosen the social distancing restrictions without first implementing extensive testing and identifying these silent and contagious carriers, we'd be putting a lot of Floridians at risk. And we'd be adding a great deal more uncertainty to the already massive task of fighting this epidemic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schillinger. Now I'd like to introduce State Senator Lori Berman.
Thank you so much and good morning. I'm State Senator Lori Berman. I represent District 31 in Central Palm Beach County. I'd like to be really clear. I, along with everyone else, would like to resume our lives the way they were before the pandemic. We all want to get out and be able to participate, be with our families and go to large gatherings. But I know that absent widespread, accessible, and accurate diagnostic and antibody testing in Florida, reopening our state and relaxing social distancing will jeopardize the health and safety of our residents, which is our paramount concern. Every decision the governor makes needs to be predicated on the advice of our nation's leading health experts. Let's not mince words. The United States now leads the world in confirmed cases and confirmed fatalities for COVID-19. We have not won the day and cannot return to normal until testing is expanded enormously. You've heard about what's being done in South Korea. In Germany, they're also leading the way. Germany recorded its first case in February and already had labs across the country stockpiling test kits. Germany is testing approximately 50,000 people a day, more than any European nation, and has widespread testing for people with few or no symptoms. At the end of this month, Germany will implement a large-scale antibody testing, and they are a model for us to be looking at. Before Florida can reopen, it must not only have at its disposal millions of diagnostic and antibody tests, but it also needs the public health army to go out and do contact tracing. Contact tracing is a tactic that will help trace the spread of the coronavirus by identifying people who may have been exposed, notifying them, quarantining them if possible, and identifying anyone they came into contact with. It's an effective treatment of containment, and we can use technology to make it even more efficient. Our governor is going to be putting together a task force looking into opening the state. He needs to be using scientific data when they look at this information. If Florida fails to rise above the dangerous passions of this president's politics and doesn't adhere strictly to those educated, we risk a second, more deadly wave right here in our state. I kind of like something that I saw on social media, and I'll close with that. The curve is flattening, and saying that the curve is flattening and we can start lifting restrictions is like saying the parachute has slowed our rate of descent and now we can take it off. So I urge our governor not to do anything without scientific information. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if you have a question for our participants, please press the raise hand button. Christine Stapleton? Are you muted?
Okay. We've heard from the experts that the antibody testing is the key to relaxing some of these social distancing requirements. But there have been reports that these tests are highly unreliable. The FDA essentially isn't regulating them. And, they're being given in, we've got one clinic that's giving them in the parking lot behind the clinic for $200. What can be done? Is this something that the state should regulate, or is this something the federal government should regulate? And are there any plans to do anything about the antibody testing?
Well, they shouldn't be doing antibody testing that's not approved by the FDA. And it is true that antibody testing is uneven in its accuracy. The kind of testing we're calling for is essentially expanding the existing testing regime. And we will perfect the antibody testing eventually, but there are real questions on its accuracy and using it as a decision-making tool. And yes, the state certainly can regulate a health institution that does testing. It certainly has that authority. And the FDA has the authority to approve the test to be given. And I have no idea whether that test has been approved or not. But there's a lot of fake stuff going on out there and a lot of mischief.
It's a very good point you raise. As of last week, there's something like 70 antibody tests out there on the market. Only one of the 70 has been approved by the FDA. And there's a number of entrepreneurs, as you mentioned, who are offering this testing. Once antibody testing becomes established and regulated and understood, and the other problem is the FDA fast-tracked the approval, so we're not even sure that the approved one is that accurate. But in time, antibody testing will be very important because we can determine who was exposed to the virus, who has developed antibodies, but we need more science to figure out what level of antibody would actually confer immunity on a person. So there's a lot of questions that are not answered, and certainly antibodies are not the total answer at this point.
Thank you, Alex Doherty with the Miami Herald.
Hi, I have a question for the Congresswoman. Obviously, the news on Friday that you were the House Democratic selection to the Oversight Committee. I wanted to ask you a bit more about that role. What kind of power will that body have? Will it have subpoena power? Will it have, what kind of oversight power will that body have? And I guess, what do you anticipate right now being your biggest piece of that obvious massive piece of money? What do you think is going to be the thing that you're going to be keeping an eye on the most in the coming weeks?
Number one, we don't have subpoena power.
Okay.
And number two, what we're going to provide oversight on is the big pot of money the Treasury got in particular. While we have oversight over the Fed as well, Treasury got a huge pot of money to bail out large industries, including the airlines, specifically the airlines. And so we want to know how they're doing it and what the deal is. But what we're really after is mischief. We're after fraud in the system. We want to see whether there's been a systematic effort to make sure the money is both distributed fairly as well as accurately in terms of congressional intent. And that's the reason for a bipartisan commission. We haven't met yet. We don't have a chair yet. We don't have anything other than the legislation yet. We will be looking at the Fed and what the Fed did to provide liquidity in the system. But we're at least a week off until we get our chair from convening. I think we're going to be back this week in Washington, so we may have an opportunity to meet then. But we don't have subpoena power. Will that be a detriment? It depends on whether Treasury and Fed cooperate. My guess is they'll cooperate, at least to a certain extent, to a bipartisan commission.
So what kind of power would you have without the subpoenas to compel Treasury to do X, Y, or Z if you spot malfeasance?
Congress. We have the power of the Congress. This is a congressional oversight committee that the President of the United States agreed to. He signed the bill. The Treasury Secretary negotiated it. So I fully expect us to be able to have considerable access and transparency.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. If you have a question that we did not get to, please feel free to email me and I will try and help answer it for you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.